Hello, so this is the 8th topic, and this is the first in a series of videos that I'm making about the topic of privity of contract. Privity is actually a really simple concept to understand. It really goes to who can enforce a contract, and the rule is, unless you're a party to the contract, you don't have rights under it. And that includes that you don't have rights to enforce the contract. Sounds pretty simple? On the whole, actually, I think it is. But some issues arise from time to time, and you'll notice that almost all of the chapter in your textbook, this is chapter 11 in particular, really talks about reasons why privity might not be such a great idea and looks at ways that privity can be circumvented and the circumstances where that might happen. I think this is interesting for you because, as you know, when it gets to exam time, one of the course learning outcomes that we have is that you will be able to critically analyse relevant legal concepts arising out of the study of contract law. And privity actually gives us a lot of room for thinking critically about what the situation is and what the situation could be and why change may or may not be a good idea. So, whilst also there may well be privity type problems in your assessment tasks, this is a topic that has come up a number of times in the exams and otherwise as a good critical analysis type question. So basically, if you're not a party to the contract, generally speaking, you can't rely on the terms of the contract. And this is really what privity of contract means. In this topic, we're going to examine the basic principles of privity and consider also how common law and statutory law have, in the context of certain types of contract, made exceptions to the requirement for privity. The rule of privity is related to the rule that consideration needs to move from the promisee. This is part of what we discussed in consideration as part of topic 3. Basically, if you haven't promised any consideration in return for the promise that you're receiving, then the law won't permit you to enforce that promise or the promise that you're receiving. When is privity relevant? Casebook looks at a whole heap of areas where there have been statutory modifications to cure issues that arise because of the rule in relation to enforceability, in relation to the variation or rescission of contracts, in relation to defences, set-offs and counterclaims, in respect to determining who has the right to sue and preventing issues of double recovery, and then lastly, preserving the rights of third parties. So let's remind ourselves in relation to contracts of the 3 basic types of contracts that we've looked at. Essentially, before we can think about the exceptions, it's really useful to make sure that we understand or remind ourselves about the types of contracts that exist. So unilateral, bilateral and multilateral contracts. Well, you well remember now what a unilateral contract is. It goes back to carbolic smoke ball, so Carlyle and carbolic smoke ball. And it's essentially the promise by one party that is made in return for the doing of an act by another party. It's called unilateral because at any given point in time, only one party has an obligation. The contract is formed by acceptance by the doing of the act that is the subject of the offer. And when the act is done, then the offer is accepted, the contract is created, and the offeror has the obligation to make the payment, pay the reward, do whatever it is that the original act induces. In these contracts, the offeree is not bound to accept by performing the required act, but as soon as they do, the offeror is bound to pay the consideration. Bilateral contract is basically a simple form of contract between 2 parties imposing mutual obligations on both of them. Offer and acceptance meet At that point, both parties have ongoing obligations of some sort. Now, they might, in fact, be extinguished almost immediately, but at the point that the contract is created, the parties both have obligations and they both have rights. Contract for the sale of goods is a really good example of that. Offer is made and it's accepted. At that point, the offeror has, well, depending on which way around it goes, there is an obligation to supply the goods and an obligation to accept delivery and to pay for them. Most of the contracts that we consider in this course are essentially bilateral contracts. So what's a multilateral contract? Essentially those between two or more than two parties, I should say, and it usually imposes reciprocal obligations on all of them. Examples of multilateral contracts can include partnership contracts, loan agreements where there's more than one lender, any arrangement where there are multiple parties doing multiple things. So what does this mean in relation to our thinking here? It's important to remember that the doctrine of privity has two aspects. No benefit can be conferred on a person who is not a party, and no burden can be imposed on a person who is not a party. So understanding whether we're dealing with a unilateral, a bilateral or a multilateral contract is really important to working out who might actually wish and expect to receive a benefit and who might be obliged to provide that benefit or to have obligations imposed on them. So in the next video, I'm going to move on to talking about the rule and its scope.